Welcome, everyone. My name is Brianne Cohen, and I'm an assistant professor in the Art and Art History Department at the University of Colorado Boulder. Thank you so much for joining us. Before we introduce today's speaker, we would like to acknowledge that CU Boulder sits on the territories of the Ute, Cheyenne, Arapaho, and Eastern Shoshone peoples, and 48 tribal nations are historically tied to the lands that make up the state of Colorado. It is critical not only to acknowledge, but also to actively address the particular harms that settler colonialism and institutions who benefit from colonialism, including CU Boulder, perpetuate on Indigenous lands and peoples, especially in the context of the Mellon Sawyer Seminar, where we are seeking to attend to more capacious humanities, arts, and sciences-based alliances for long-term ecological transformation. Simultaneously, we assert that such alliances must also acknowledge the sociocultural, artistic, linguistic, and other strategies that Indigenous communities have used and continue to use to respond to intensive ecological disruptions. We also want to thank our collaborative partners today. This program is generously funded by a Sawyer Seminar on the Comparative Study of Cultures grant from the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation. And our talk today is made possible through the National Science Foundation funded Social Science Extreme Events Research, or SEER network, and the Converge facility housed at the Natural Hazards Center at CU Boulder. Additionally, we thank our institutional partners at CU Boulder, the Nest Studio for the Arts, the Natural Hazards Center, the Center for Native American and Indigenous Studies, and the Art and Art History Department. This public lecture is one of multiple, along with several art exhibitions around the Boulder-Denver area that will be hosted this semester and next as part of the 2020-2021 Mellon Sawyer Seminar, Deep Horizons, Making Visible an Unseen Spectrum of Ecological Casualties and Prospects. We aim to traverse multiple disciplines and perspectives to investigate intersectional questions concerning the changing planet as it affects specific peoples, communities, wildlife species, and ecosystems in varying and inequitable ways. This project calls for empathy, attunement, and an outlook that encompasses a diversity of individuals, communities, and collaborative entities committed to climate justice and more ethically durable futures. Please visit our Environmental Futures website to learn more and register for upcoming events. Before we introduce our main speaker, there are a couple Zoom protocols that we ask you to follow. First of all, please keep your microphones muted so that no one is distracted by any background noises. And secondly, if you have a question, please type it into the chat box. Only hosts can view the questions, and when Julie Z is finished with her lecture, we will take some time to respond to selected questions. I would now like to turn it over to Jennifer Ho, who is Professor of Ethnic Studies at CU Boulder and the Director of the Center for Humanities and the Arts. Jennifer will introduce our speaker for tonight. Thank you so much, Jennifer.
Hi, everyone. So first of all, a few apologies. I am in a house that's under construction still. So you are hearing an echo and the light's not great. So apologies about that. Second of all, I'm so pleased to be able to introduce Julie Z to you because I have been a fan of her work for a very long time. She is considered a rock star in many circles, including Asian American Studies. And I'm also the president of the Association for Asian American Studies. And because he said it was okay, I'm gonna give a shout out to Doug Ishii, who is tuning in from the University of Washington, Seattle. And I think one of the great things about Zoom now, which is maybe one of the few minor things we can say is a blessing about Zoom, oh, see, there's Doug, is that we can have people come from all over the nation to listen to Julie's talk. So without further ado, Dr. Julie Z is a professor of American Studies at UC Davis. Her research focuses on political ecology, urbanization, and planning, including links and interactions between the political economy of spatial form and social relations with nature by focusing on environmental justice and inequalities, the relationship between social movements and policy implementation, and the areas of public and environmental humanities at the intersection of three interdisciplinary fields: environmental, urban, and ethnic studies from the vantage point of American studies. She's the author of Noxious New York, The Racial Politics of Urban Health and Environmental Justice, Fantasy Islands, Chinese Dreams, and Ecological Fears in an Age of Climate Crisis, and most recently, Environmental Justice in a Moment of Danger. She edited the collection Sustainability, Approaches to Environmental Justice and Social Power, and has written over 50 articles and book chapters. She has also been an invited keynote at international conferences and events in Sweden, Germany, China, Italy, Abu Dhabi, France, and Canada. She's given talks at over 75 universities and colleges in the US, ranging from Ivy League institutions, community colleges, public universities, liberal arts colleges, and also at institutions like San Francisco MoMA, New York Academy of Medicine, and the Asia Society, state agencies, service organizations, and community groups that are interested in her areas of research throughout New York and California. She is clearly extraordinarily accomplished. Please join me in welcoming Julie Z.
Thank you for that introduction. I really appreciate the invite and the ability to come talk and learn with you. Let me just share my screen right now. Is it shared? I can't see. Okay, hold on. Okay, I'm still learning how to navigate everything. It's a lot to handle. The older you get, the harder it becomes to do two things at once. So thank you again for this invite. It's really exciting to be able to come and talk to such an interdisciplinary audience on a campus that is a clear leader in so many areas, not just environmental humanities, environmental sociology, ethnic studies, and so on. Thank you again for the logistical help. So this talk today is called Climate Justice in a World on Fire, or Ice Will Melt. And it is new work for me, but it comes out of the Environmental Justice in a Moment of Danger book. So in terms of, let me just start by with this opening. The world is burning and we're in a moment of monsters. In California, where I live, climate change has led to hotter temperatures and more intense wildfires that have burned over 4 million acres this year, the most ever on record. When I started that paragraph 2 weeks ago, it was 3 million acres. And I had to today change it to 4 in a span of 2 weeks. So I think some of you have seen, the apocalyptic orange air. The eerie skies over San Francisco burning bright orange, and the apocalyptic homage to Blade Runner 2049. Crises of political legitimacy and overt state or state-sanctioned violence define the US in ways not formerly visible to many people, and of course to others has always been very known and lived for particular communities, especially communities of color and tribal communities. Authoritarianism is global and interlinked with racism, anti-immigrant sentiment, anti-refugee sentiment, gender violence, militarism, and corporate capitalism. That crises are interconnected. Police and state-sanctioned violence, pandemic, and public health crises is apparent to everyone around the world who protest against fascists, and increasing economic and social inequality made catastrophically worse under COVID. The climate crisis has come home to many people who never thought about it before, in the shape of hurricanes, heat waves, and wildfires, and the old political order is crumbling. What takes its place is under fierce struggle. The action on the streets, in classrooms, and in stories are shaped by government chambers, corporate boardrooms, and protests in the streets. So the outline today that I want to talk about is talking a little bit about the book Environmental Justice in the Moment of Danger, the key questions and argument, and the work today, which is new, comes out of the 3rd chapter. So I will then ask today's questions and then talk about what I think are, wait, why did that just move? Abolitionist climate justice narratives, think about the search towards freedom, and then move to Q&A. So this is just a series of facts that I like to share with people. Some of this is known to you, some of it may not be known. The US is the single greatest contributor to cumulative carbon emissions since 1750. 25% of cumulative historical carbon emissions lies at the feet of the US. If you looked only until 1882, it was obviously Britain. So between Britain and the US, that is by far the largest responsible entities for global carbon emissions. Now, So not just historical carbon, but right now 100 companies are responsible for 71% of emissions, and 20 firms are responsible for a third of global emissions. Less than 5% of the world's population is in the US, but 20% of the world's incarcerated peoples are in the US. And as we know, extreme racial disparities for Black, Latinx, and Indigenous peoples. The US has by far the highest rate of police killings, 4 times higher than the next highest nation. Americans own, again, we are only about 4% of the world's population, but own 45% of the world's privately held firearms. We are responsible by far for the most interpersonal violence from gun deaths. And the US has approximately 20% of the world's COVID deaths and vast racial disproportionalities in terms of rates and also deaths for Black, Latino, and Indigenous populations. So 20% of those deaths. So this is the kind of context that we're living in right now. And so it's very difficult to think about how we have a radical hope, or how do we think of building a radical hope? Or, when Obama said the arc of history bends towards justice, it is hard to believe that right now. It is hard to think that that is possible. How hard it is to speak of freedom or imagine a future in the face of these unfolding multiple crises of public health, climate, and democracy. Just today, there was a leakage of from ExxonMobil, which showed that they are planning for 17% carbon emissions gain. So these, again, were just leaked today. And so, I want to start thinking about what all of this sense of crises and violence and what it all means now. So going back to the book, Environmental Justice in a Moment of Danger. The key questions for that book are: what crossroads of moment are we in now? What might we learn from environmental justice moments in our moment of danger? It's precisely, I think, in this moment of danger, and if this book came out in January 2020, the proceeds for this book go to 2 environmental justice organizations I've worked with for over one of the organizations I've worked with for over 25 years. Uprose in New York. The other one is the Community Water Center in Visalia that does really important work around water justice. So what I think I want to suggest is that it is precisely in this moment that we need to foreground the stories and perspectives of environmental and climate justice activists who continue to do now what they have always done. Environmental justice movements link diverse problems, and they defy state and corporate attempts to artificially separate harms and issues. For example, cleaving out health as separate from pollution, social as separate from environmental factors. Environmental justice activists, like justice activists in many fields, like reproductive justice, oppose venture capitalists, they oppose privatization proponents, developers, racists, cops, and fascists. Environmental justice movements and the organizers and communities that make them fight and struggle against these forces. They grow, they write and rewrite stories, they make artwork, they sing songs of freedom, and they seek to build and grow a different world than the one we currently inhabit. So even though this book came out in January 2020, the moments of danger are only more intense, and it is a fast evolving one. I was thinking about this before because I went and talked to the grad seminar, and I was thinking about the importance of showing up. And then I was thinking, it's actually quite dangerous for people of color to show up right now in public, because of the increasing force of armed militias, and so it's my own feeling of like how fast things are changing. We are facing things that we have not seen in a generation, and depending on how you define it, maybe more than a century. And so there is a set of interfolding crises, including political crises, economic, health, and environmental. And the political crises that is going to unfold, I think a lot of us are watching the election and very, nervous and about what the implications will be, what kinds of explosions of violence will happen then. And so this some of you might remember Jake Tapper right after the debate was talking about that was a hot mess inside of a dumpster fire, inside a train wreck. you know, and so I posted this on Instagram and said, this is what 2020 is like. And then everybody was like, yeah, in a wildfire, in a climate crisis, you know, with militias on your back and so on. So the argument for the book is that environmental justice movements are freedom struggles and that they are particularly significant now. They are intersectional, whether or not they use that word, and they think of time and space in a capacious way that is really important now. It's always important, but it's particularly important now. And by freedom struggles, I am using a lot of the work from Black freedom movements and Indigenous thinkers and activists. So the argument of the book that environmental justice is a freedom movement is drawn by my experiences and work with environmental justice movements for over 27 years. That environmental justice and thinking of it as a freedom struggle means engaging with history, violence, imaginary, and visionary perspectives. Simply put, justice provides a soundtrack of freedom. And that soundtrack of freedom is one that is framed against violence and against racist violence. And it's for freedom capaciously defined. Primarily defined as freedom from the market, freedom of the market. Reframing unjust environments and climate catastrophes as rooted in history and politics enables a justice-oriented approach to problems that are focused less on technological or policy solutionism that ends up maintaining a social and economic and political order that produces the conditions of environmental violence in wildly disproportionate ways. Social movements have long understood the prevalence of violence for people of color, indigenous, and poor peoples in the US and globally, and how narratives can act as a resource to reframing problems to such violence. For justice movements, it's not enough to say that problems are connected. When environmental and climate justice movements narrate their connections analytically, they understand them as urgently spatial, moral, temporal, and political. So that's the kind of overarching argument of the book. Today is an extension of my third chapter, which looks at radical hope in the context of disasters. So that chapter looks at Hurricane Katrina, Hurricane Maria. It looks at Kivalina and climate justice initiatives in Arctic indigenous villages, as well as in Uprose's fight against gentrification in Brooklyn. And so those are kind of the cases that I look at in the third chapter. But this chapter today is focused again on the question that I raised in the third chapter. What does radical hope look like now in the face of these interconnected disasters? What does freedom look like in the face of violence, excessive violence in its myriad forms, gentrification, surveillance, policing, and deportation? So that's the question. And what I'm going to do is to suggest that abolitionist climate justice narratives offer a solution, not a solution, a response. They offer a partial imaginative reclamation and recognition in a brutalizing economic and political system that seeks to deny the rights of survival for vulnerable people and communities, animals, and ecosystems. Abolitionist climate narratives, abolitionist climate justice narratives disrupt dominant modes of engagement with climate change politics. The predominant affective sphere of climate politics based on fear and an inability to imagine a climate change future. So what does abolitionist climate justice look like, and what does it mean? Let me start by talking about what I mean by them. So this is, the answer to those questions. I argue that these narratives grounded within social movements are trying to imagine what that looks like. So what is an abolitionist climate justice narrative? And where does it merge from historically and theoretically? Abolition of slavery and abolition and climate justice as a social movement are linked through the seeming impossibility of their political goals in their respective times. And here I was impacted by Chris Hayes, who in 2014 wrote an article in The Nation called The New Abolitionism. He says that averting planetary disaster due to climate change is only possible if fossil fuel companies relinquish $10 trillion in wealth. And this wealth, again, is highly concentrated. The only historical analogy of companies, in this case companies, but relinquishing excessive wealth is when slave owners fought the abolition of slavery. And he begins, and this is a quote that I think is important. Let me be clear and state the obvious. There is no moral comparison between the enslavement of Africans and African Americans and the burning of carbon power to power our devices. Humans are humans and molecules are molecules. Comparison I'm making is a comparison between the political economy of slavery and the political economy of fossil fuel, end quote. The political economy of climate justice and climate justice movements demands that oil and gas companies leave their product in the ground. And the climate justice movement in the form of coalitions like Keep It in the Ground or Extinction Rebellion, and in the hundreds of anti-pipeline, anti-fracking protests in the US, in indigenous struggles in the Amazon, are demanding that political and economic interests, very powerful and violent ones, are forced to say goodbye to trillions of dollars of wealth. It is impossible to point to any other precedent, Chris Hayes says, other than abolition. The climate justice movement demands, in his words, the ultimate abolition of fossil fuels. So despite this, despite the link between political economy of the abolition of slavery and the abolition of fossil fuels, and there is an emerging scholarly discussion about what this means and what this looks like. Some of this is coming out in geography in abolition ecologies, which is Hainan and Ibarra. They talk about the impact of the tributaries of the environmental justice movement, abolition geographies, the work of Ruth Wilson Gilmore, the Black radical tradition, including Du Bois's abolition democracy, and indigenous scholarship grounded in territoriality and more than human in relations. Some of the other literatures that I think are part of this conversation are from world system sociologist Jason Moore, who names what he calls reparations ecologies. And he specifically talks about climate justice and food sovereignty as examples of reparations ecologies, which he defines as politics that believe, quote, fundamental to remembering the violence and inequality of modernity and coming to terms with the way of organizing life. Not just between humans, but between humans and the rest of nature in a way that is emancipatory. Reparations ecologies in the form of food sovereignty and climate justice involves, he says, a rethinking of nature, humanity, and justice, insofar as it demands a taking of the domains of life, education, healthcare, housing, out of the market. So he says that the critique of capitalism's basis, including the nature-society binary, aligns very squarely with the climate justice movement. The taking off the market and making connections that collapse and exceed binaries, hierarchy, and dualisms are what he means by reparations ecology. This critique in the climate policy context means the dominance, for example, of thinking about carbon trading or carbon markets as the solution to global regimes of climate politics. So abolitionist ecology demands, quote, recognizing the racialized ways that nature has always been unevenly socially produced through relationships of empire, settler colonialism, and racial capitalism, according to Hainan and Ibarra, which again aligns with Moore's conception of reparations ecology. The socially uneven productions of nature shapes the roots and consequences of climate change. And I already gave you the statistics about the historical carbon emissions. Many scholars have talked about the globally uneven and racially disproportionate ways in which climate change impacts through a colonial, a post-colonial, and decolonial lens. The broadest impacts of climate change are most devastating for the global south and the poor, those with the least responsibility for producing carbon emissions. In terms of thinking about abolitionist climate justice, the first person who's really using that term in the social sciences are Malini Raghunathan and Eve Bratman. And they ask what abolitionism means for climate justice. They draw on a case study in a majority Black neighborhood in Washington, D.C., again, using the Black radical tradition, feminist, and anti-racist scholarship to show how local community members reframe the dominant notions of what the authors call mainstream climate resilience thinking. This idea of like a mainstream discourse around climate resilience also shapes the discussion of climate adaptation, refugees, resilience and disasters, all of which embody different assumptions about what the roots of the problems are and how to fix it. In contrast to policy narrow descriptions of climate resilience, community members in this Black community in DC center intersectional approaches that foreground historical, ethical, and anti-racist critiques of those practices. A key component for abolitionist climate justice is understanding, again, the role of history, the focus on rehumanizing language and practices in the face of historical dehumanization of Black communities through an ethics of care. So I think that, you see this kind of emergent conversations within the social sciences, but I think it's very ripe to think about in terms of the cultural lens. The idea of abolitionist climate justice has not been, in my search, really applied yet to the cultural sphere, but those connections are, I argue, vitally important, given that culture and narratives are crucially important to articulating capacious notions of freedom. So freedom and justice begin often as an imaginative act outside the sphere of what seems politically possible. So historian Robin Kelley talks about the Black radical imagination as not a thing, but a process. The ideas generated from what Gramsci calls a philosophy of praxis. It's about how people in transformative social movements move, shifted their ideas, rethought inherited categories, located and overturned blatant, subtle, and invisible modes of domination. What was unimaginable, in other words, becomes possible. But this shift begins as an act of radical imagination. And so Kelley writes in Freedom Dreams, this is his quote, "Progressive social movements do not simply produce statistics and narratives of oppression. Rather, the best ones do what great poetry does. Transport us to another place, compel us to relive horrors, and more importantly, enable us to imagine a new society. We must remember that the conditions and the existence of social movements enables people to imagine something different, to realize that things need not be this way. Or to put it another way, the most radical art is not protest art, but works that take us to a different place, envision a different way of seeing, perhaps a different way of feeling." So this is where I get to my example of an abolitionist climate justice narrative. I'm going to talk about the show called The North Pole, and I'm going to argue that it is an abolitionist climate justice narrative, one that relies on emotion work and narrative strategies, that identifies the agents and actors for climate disaster significantly differently than mainstream analyses of climate change from a science and policy dominant frame. This dominant frame has this kind of, massive way of having undifferentiated causes, like humans did this to the planet. And the affective mode is based on despair and hopelessness. Climate justice, cultural production, and abolitionist climate justice narratives are very different. They refuse to maintain a business as usual, technological and capitalist approach to climate change, and they resolutely reject an affect of despair, climate anxiety, and climate grief. So culture and narratives are important then, as not just as a resource or roadmap for policy, but they can motivate and mobilize, especially when they're linked to justice movements on the ground. Black radical and musician Boots Riley, who voices a central character in The North Pole, elsewhere, when he's talking about his film Sorry to Bother You, a radical anti-capitalist film from 2018, he was interviewed as saying, quote, "Rebellion is edited out of the worlds we have built. We put those rebellions back into the stories we create and consume," end quote. Abolitionist climate justice narratives are rebellion stories. They imagine and politicize generational anxieties over climate change and futurity into social movement action. So my case study for an abolitionist climate justice narrative is The North Pole. It is not unique. There are actually many examples when you start looking for them of abolitionist climate justice narratives in hip hop and spoken word. This show in particular is a 7-episode, 2-season show that's focused on 4 characters, the ones you see there. 3 of them, Marcus, Benny, and Nina, are working class Black and Latinx, and they grew up in Oakland, while another, Finn, is a white transplant from Minnesota. The executive producers are Movement Generation and Rosario Dawson, the actress that is pretty well known. Movement Generation was founded by Bay Area community organizers that were heavily impacted by the racial and environmental disasters associated with Hurricane Katrina in New Orleans. The 3 creators of this show, Josh Healy, Yvonne Iturriaga, and Darren Colson, have been quoted saying, "Climate change means both the world's climate and the devastating impacts of gentrification." Healy writes, "We wanted to make the North Pole because there's no place on Earth like Oakland, and there's no planet on the universe like Earth. I call both these places home, and both are suffering through their own kind of climate change. At a time when whole communities and environments are being displaced and disposed of, the North Pole is our creative picket line turned comedy roast." So this is a they're very short episodes, and they're really aimed at young audiences. Movement Generation understands the complex problems of climate change, but they explicitly reject the dominant narratives about it. And they foreground and represent a climate justice frame. This frame understands history and emotion in equal measure, and an equal measure away from grief towards anger and rebellion. The show centralizes the voices, the humor, and the fight of young people of color in the Bay Area for justice. They embody radical politics and theorizing in a few important ways. They model politics where critical consciousness about interconnections of kinship and capacious notions of home, space, and time lead to direct political action and a politics of care and solidarity. Once they begin to understand how precarity and vulnerability are connected, they're able to act. They do so by building solidarity and growing opposition to hegemonic power and institutions. In the face of state-sanctioned violence, the protagonists of abolitionist climate justice narratives center their resistance to dominant structures and institutions of policing. And I think in that sense, they are modeling what non-naive radical hope that also has a clear sense of what's at stake, what that actually looks like. So the basic plot of the film is really focused on, again, the North Pole as an area of rapidly gentrifying Oakland. There was a report that Oakland in particular is the most gentrified city in the US. And so their precarity and their vulnerability to not being able to afford to live where they grew up, their displacement from their home, they basically analogize to the polar bears losing their home to climate change. And so there's a lot of material in here. And if you just read the plot, it seems very like there's a lot of themes in there. But because it's so focused on the stories and the people themselves, it's quite it's different than, like, listening to it, like, say for example this lecture. And so there's an example for where the character Finn, the white housemaid from Minnesota, he works for a company that's heavily involved in geoengineering, for example. The company's products are trees that put carbon back into the air, but they also double as surveillance cameras. The show lightly fictionalizes what is kind of already happening. And the geoengineering and surveillance trees encapsulate the mainstream technologically oriented climate change solutions that are proffered, but are actually completely anti the agenda of justice or abolition. In Oakland, technological surveillance and policing are tightly bound, specifically to the racially disproportionate impacts of Black and Brown young communities in this hyper-gentrifying context, the most gentrified city in the world. So in the first episode of season 1, the housemates, Nina, Marcus, and Ben, they get a rent. They have to basically, come up with rent because the housing crisis has doubled their rent. And so they go to Whole Foods and start, basically like GoFundMe for themselves, but it's called Save the Polar Bears. So they talk about how polar bears are like the rare, majestic species, the working class people of color in the neighborhood who are basically being increasingly displaced by the hipsters and the gentrifiers. And so the whole season, the whole plot of season 1 is really focused on this question of gentrification and also housing, the housing crisis in the Bay Area. So on the one hand, you have lots of empty houses that are been investor speculator boom, but then this huge homelessness problem and also housing precarity. So the second season is really focused around the narrative of Benny, who is undocumented from Central America. And in the final season of, well, I don't want to ruin too much of it, but he is threatened with deportation in part because of his activism in season 1 and his direct action against an eviction. So Benny is one of California's 2 million undocumented young people subject to deportation after an arrest. So in the season 1 finale, he basically takes a stand against this eviction of a family, and then he has been brought into the deportation regime. In the second season, the North Pole further reinforces the lessons of the first season around kinship and the capaciousness of understanding time and space. Season 2 focuses on climate change, deportation, and global migrations as a way to further analyze this, the idea of home from a climate justice standpoint and what home means in the context of war and climate change. Wildfires are exacerbated by climate change are also a plot line for the season. The show threads these issues together to centralize an abolitionist view of policing and deportation in tracing out what justice looks like for Benny and his friends, even though they never use the term abolition. So in the season 2, his approach to the deportation that he is facing, he decides that the way he's going to fight that is to run for sheriff. He runs against the local sheriff who is seeking to serve him with the deportation order, inverting the classic tale of the noble sheriff and the lawless criminal. The show relies upon but inverts these archetypes. Like the real world undocumented youth activists who proclaim themselves undocumented and unafraid, Benny takes his cause public with the help of his friends' vocal social media activism on his behalf. And so the way he uses media, it takes his individual vulnerability into a social and collective one. And a lot of the thread of the second season is focused on how he sort of builds that community around himself. As in season 1, the penultimate episode proves the personal breakthrough that leads to the finale, which foregrounds direct action. Benny suffers through moments of crisis where he doubts whether his campaign for Alameda County Sheriff is working. He imagines himself surrounded in a forest. Well, they actually, they do drugs in the forest. That's not giving away a plot. But in this moment, he is surrounded in the forest by fences with a bed of burning coals on the floor, with angry, racist, and anti-immigrant voices shaming him. His aunt speaks to him and pushes him to be strong by telling him he must continue the journey of his ancestors. He helps to fight the demonizing voices of the racists that are literally in his head. And with her voice in his head, he is able to drown out the anti-immigrant and racist narratives and to connect the dots about why he is here and what to do about the problems both he as an individual and his communities face. So in the finale, this is where he's like doing his final plea in the campaign for sheriff. This is what Benny says. Truth is, I didn't want to come here. None of us did. We were bleeding a civil war with bombs and bullets paid for by the CIA. You want to arrest someone? Arrest the Salvadorian army who firebombed their town. Arrest Lockheed Martin who sold them weapons. Arrest the ghost of Ronald Reagan. If you want to stop invading your shores, stop invading ours. So what he does there is to connect, of course, U.S. foreign policy in Central America and corporate globalization leading to NAFTA as some of the unnamed push factors that destabilize economies and homes throughout the Americas and which racist nativists ignore. Racist nativism is focused on defending home in a context that ignores the histories of US violence over space and time that have destabilized the homes and ecosystems abroad. Climate change, too, in the face of massive hurricanes and megadroughts, are another example of push factor for migration. A number of reports have argued that the recent spike of migration from Central America is directly related to climate change. As justice-oriented movements argue from the perspective of anti-colonial and anti-racist positions, we are here because you were there. Climate refugees move globally in the world, thus as a direct legacy of 500 years of colonialism, modernity, and development. The industrial food system similarly relies on the movement of farm workers to follow crops, yet the idea of migration of workers over political borders remains anathema to nativists. Free trade agreements and industrial agricultural industries seek free borders for their products and their pollution while limiting protections for workers and the environment. Racist nativists defend their homes with guns in spatial and historical isolation while exploiting land and labor globally. Their vision is of a compliant, uncritical, and unorganized mass. But justice movements take their conditions of exploitation and politicize them outside of the individual. Here, critical consciousness and storytelling is a key to action. After the respective drug-fueled epiphanies that allow them to re-narrate their own stories and their own doubt, their own struggles, they make it back to a campsite. And there's a polar bear that's voiced by Boots Riley as another fifth character of the series. And so throughout the series, only Nina can see this polar bear. But after they have these epiphanies, all of them can see this character who I call Rebellion Polar Bear. And he says, I've been waiting for you to show up. Before this moment, only Nina could see him. But as they gain understanding of their seemingly individual problems and their roots, and how to maintain their sense of care and community through their relationships with each other and with nature, they are transformed. They all become Rebellion Polar Bear, ready for the fight against the big structure and histories that shape their precarity. Their consciousness has shifted, so they return political animals. They are political animals who maintain a sense of equilibrium in the face of relentless pain and violence, structural, psychological, and environmental. They return home to Oakland stronger than before they left. So when he makes this final pitch, he narrates this abolitionist climate justice perspective on home and kinship, one that takes this global, spatial, and historical perspective. He looks calmly at the camera and says, and this is a quote, as my tia Carmen says, borders are the scars on Mother Earth. I'm a child of El Salvador and the US, but my home is Oakland. I'm an undocumented American. I'm not asking for your pity, forgiveness, or your money. I'm not even asking for your vote. I'm asking for your humanity. Migration is a human right, and the truth is migration is natural. Monarch butterflies fly 3,000 miles every year from Mexico to Minnesota and back again. We're all just animals looking for a place to call home, and I found mine. I'm not a butterfly, I'm a polar bear. The North Pole, North Oakland, originally and forever Ohlone land, end quote. So in a context of extreme dehumanization of people of color in general and undocumented Americans in particular, he asked for your humanity. But beyond humanity, Benny describes what humanity means in a world that is more than human, when he says we're all just animals looking for a place to call home. He points to the absurdity of political borders when species migrate to survive. But his identification is not with the monarch butterflies, but with the polar bear. Here is he is majestic and threatened, but now he is ready to fight. His vision of home is not a narrow parochial one. By situating Ohlone land, his view of home centralizes indigenous histories and situates his migration stories with native struggles for sovereignty. This capacious view of kinship, time and space, and care to rely on each other and create a version of home that is not based on defensive property of income as markers of home ownership and belonging, but instead based on a politics of justice, based on care and community. And I'm struck right now, on Friday, there's a seminar called Abolition on Stolen Land. So I think, that's a lot of the framework for the North Pole. So abolitionist climate justice narratives in general, and the North Pole in particular, recognize the violence of modernity and why and how Black and Indigenous peoples have different and threatened relationships to home. The North Pole and its storytellers, like Movement Generation, are grounded in the cultural politics of home that are built on art, love, and relationships, including with and among animals. imagined and lived in response to historical trauma, ongoing violence, and the horrific disasters due to climate change. The seeds of a climate just future, a cultural politics of non-naive radical hope, have to be found in the fight itself, grounded in intergenerational struggles for racial and social justice. Abolitionist climate justice perspectives are communal, not individualized, care-driven, not market-dominant, and they capaciously characterize home, not defensively. Benny connects his precarity to the endangered polar bear vulnerable to climate change, threatened to the point of extinction. But beyond connection, he fights back with a solidarity-based vision of survival in a world that invites his removal and the likely death of places spanning from North Oakland to the North Pole. He is able to move towards a radical vision of sanctuary and abolition through consciousness and connection. He goes from endangered polar bear to rebellion polar bear. Rebellion polar bear is no less endangered, but he acts with far more agency before he changes his consciousness and reframes his narrative. The point of the justice movement, in other words, is in the fight itself and in the shift of consciousness of the characters or us as actors to take a direct stand against injustice. In the last scene of the series, it's shot in the spaghetti Western style. Benny faces directly against the sheriff who seeks to enforce the deportation order. The show rejects the dominant idea of the law as the enforcer of justice, and the show invites the audience to identify with Benny, the lawbreaker, and those who stand with him. The crowd gathers on both sides in a tense standoff. And finally, Rebellion Polar Bear shows up. He walks up and everybody can see him. He joins Benny's side and says, "No polar bear is scared of fucking ice. No, bruh, not today." It plays with the joke that polar bears are unafraid of ICE, their home under threat, and ICE, Immigration and Customs Enforcement, which seeks to throw people out of their homes based on a paper and not their ties to a community. Rebellion Polar Bear takes the deportation order from the sheriff and throws it to a local pyro Bill who grins and burns it down. This moment literalizes how the problems of climate change, deportation, and policing are connected as systems of political violence that also illustrate how they must be fought. On the one hand, the burning of the deportation order is a literal burning down of the system. ICE will melt when faced with principal resistance, whether that means direct action or non-compliance. The stability of ICE, Immigration and Customs Enforcement, is based on the credibility of the system and the ideologies that support it. That edifice is based on consensus in the system that can be withdrawn if enough people and organized interests come to see things differently, whether that's through social movements, legal fights, direct action, and importantly, culture and narrative. At the same time, polar bears face the reality that ice caps are melting due to climate change. On the other end, this instability and the weakening of the ice shelf is a product of the political system. Its protection and that of the polar bears' homes and habitat likewise depends on the same people and interests, movements, law, direct action, and culture. In both the invocation that ice must melt and ice is melting, the show grounds a radical interconnected vision and an abolitionist climate justice politics against policing, deportation, and gentrification based on racial, environmental, and social justice perspectives. So in conclusion, the search for walls and borders in the face of climate change induced migration is a political and fiction that imprisons some more than others, but ultimately everyone on the planet is implicated in these systems of violence. What justice-oriented freedom struggles and movements know is that freedom can only come to those who know their histories of resistance, tell and remake their stories, and who fight their own destruction at the hands of state and capital. Ultimately, the North Pole models for its audience a process of how to take collective and direct action and reject the despair and nihilism far too common in a climate generation. Sociologist Daniel Aldana Cohen reminds us every bit of victory is worth winning. That's how I see Gramsci's war of position in the 21st century, as a carbon trench war. From each dug-in position, the chance for sudden surge forward. We don't know when that moment comes, but we fight stubbornly until it does, so that we're ready. To keep our spirits, we share stories about flashes of heroism, about long, uncertain living, about liquid dangers and warm pleasures. The North Pole is a rebellion narrative from the carbon trench war. It is an abolitionist climate justice story, one of many, and whose ranks are growing, that seeks to represent and aims to enact through such representation a hopeful, humorous, oppositional, creative politics. The North Pole is a story that creates and narrates radical hope, and thus speaks to and moves an abolitionist agenda as a freedom story. It draws on capaciousness vis-a-vis home, via kin and non-human nature, over space and time, and in community, to develop a narrative of non-naive hope in a moment when the forces of capitalism, white supremacy, and carbon addiction are both dominant and under attack. So I think I'll just end it there and take questions. Brianne, Bonnie.
Thank you so much, Julie. Maybe you can, well, I don't know if we should keep your screen shared, but if people have questions, please put them in the chat box and I can send them out to Julie to answer about her really inspiring talk. Really appreciate this fascinating talk, especially this example of North Pole is so interesting, you know, as an example of abolitionist climate justice narrative. So if people have questions, please go ahead and send them. You know, maybe I can start out while we're waiting for people to formulate their questions. I'm interested in this idea of kinship with, you know, the animal world in this particular instance that you gave. And I'm just wondering about, you know, this emergent discourse around abolitionist climate justice narratives. How capacious is it at this point? How capacious could it be? Can you imagine these, you know, cultural narratives emerging or converging with non-human beings? You know, so not just about the mattering of dehumanized humans and thinking about kinship with animals in particular, because they're their closest kind of, you know, relatives in the natural world, so to speak, but the mattering of inhuman beings like plants and trees and rocks that we see a lot of in Native and Indigenous studies. How far do you see this kind of narrative structure going in that sense?
Well, I think you've already answered, you know, the question, which is, I think Indigenous storytelling and Indigenous ontology is based on more than human, and a way of understanding like relations and time and family and kinship in ways that are very broad. So in the first chapter of the book, I talk about Standing Rock and Indigenous anti-pipeline struggles, and a lot of that their organizing and their worldview is based exactly on that. You know, talking about that the idea of, you know, these are our relations, all our relations. You know, this is a living thing. You know, and so that they were water protectors. You know, not environmentalists. That you have to think about, you know, sacred sites as places of that there isn't the separation of life and death. You know, and so that's why, you know, native remains and burial and return is so important. And so I think the idea of kinship and agential beings is, you know, I mean, not to overly generalize, but I think it's fair to say that, you know, Indigenous worldviews embody that. And I think that that's really, that's as, I think it can go as broad as it can go.
Thank you. Okay, great. So I have a question from Bonnie. You know, last week in the seminar, we discussed Radical Care by Tamara Neese and Hillel Hobart. Excuse me if I'm pronouncing that incorrectly. Where do you see intersections, parallels, or constellations of radical hope and radical care emerging?
I don't know a lot about, you know, the radical care. I haven't read, you know, that in particular. And, you know, I don't know where the convergence is. But I think, you know, for me, a lot of the discussion about hope in a climate change context, you know, is very framed by, you know, the way in which the science is quite frightening. Do you know what I mean? And so, you know, the scale and scope can be kind of overwhelming. And a lot of people have talked about, you know, how can you, you know, there's just despair, like in the face of the immensity of it. Do you know what I mean? And so I think, you know, there's a reason why, you know, thinking about what radical hope looks like in the face of the science, which is not very hopeful, you know, that's kind of the context in which I'm trying to talk about radical hope. But I think that there probably, you know, there probably are convergences, but I would be interested actually in knowing more about what radical care looks like in a way, you know, that is it different than self-care? You know, some of in the earlier session with that when we were talking about like emergent strategy and Adrienne Marie Brown, and you know, I think that there's some of that. There is some overlap there, but I don't know the radical care very well.
Thank you. Lori Peak asks, will you please share more about intergenerational movements for abolitionist climate justice movements? I'm especially interested in the role of children and youth in these movements. Thank you so much for the talk.
Yeah, I think children and youth are huge. You know, they're huge. They're huge on the legal front, and they're huge in the they're huge in terms of the organizing and the cultural production. And so there's one, I have to find his name, but one of the plaintiffs in the youth lawsuit suing over climate change is an indigenous youth hip hop spoken word activist and artist. So I forget his name. I mean, I can pull it up, but I'll get distracted if I try to do it right now. So, I mean, I think that, you know, a lot of this, the organizing and the cultural production is youth driven. And that's why I think the North Pole, you know, in choosing to have the narrative be sort of relatively short and, you know, accessible to people on YouTube, like they're very conscious and aware of youth audiences, which I think is really important. And they're also, they're also very aware of what works as a, I think, you know, affective strategy. Do you know what I mean? Because they know how many people, you know, what that a lot of young people are kind of in despair mode, you know, and there's all this research about climate grief, and, you know, a lot of people are saying they're, you know, not going to have kids, and what's the point, and, you know, all this kind of stuff. So these questions of futurity are, you know, even more urgent and poignant, you know, coming from young people. And Greta Thunberg, you know, who all of us know by name, you know, has done a really good job of trying to like make sure that the media doesn't just focus on her as like the white savior, you know, girl. You know, I mean, she's been very intentional about that. Whether the media ignores all of the climate justice and indigenous climate justice activists around her, you know, it's definitely not because she is doing that, like trying to take up, to be the symbol of the white, pure, you know, girl who's going to be the leader. Do you know what I mean? And so I think that there's really interesting organizing and activism from the especially from indigenous youth around climate justice.
Thank you. Related to this, Quinn Livingston asks, you spoke about the radical action and dreams that are more commonly seen in younger generations currently. Where do you think that comes from? And is it important for older generations to adopt some of this radicalism as well?
Yeah, I mean, I think that goes back to the last question about this being an intergenerational movement. And I think that, you know, there's a lot of, without oversimplifying, you know, that this is a clash of generations. Do you know what I mean? But I think that, you know, it's really important for there to be connection between like elders. And that's why in the North Pole, the radical elders in the main characters' lives are really important. So I didn't really talk about them, but Nina's aunt is actually she's played by Erica Huggins, who's a major Black Panther in Oakland. And so she plays her grandmother who narrates the Black Panther history. So there's like meta levels there, you know? So like she has the actual Black Panther talking about the Black Panthers in there. And then Tia Carmen, that Benny's aunt is a queer radical from who fought in Guatemala, you know? And so part of it is about knowing those radical histories. And so it's the millennials, because they're millennials, you know, the characters, but their grandparents are really, those elder generations are really important to their consciousness too. And so actually, I didn't really talk about it at length, but, it's a lot of this, the narrative is about their own struggles with self-doubt and their own struggles with, the futility of these things, their own addiction to social media, like activism and stuff. And so I think that the show is really smart, but it's not overly didactic, and so I watched it with my class. Like we just took one session and watched all 7 episodes. And, without like, because I wanted to see it, because it's one of those things where it's like, you can imagine someone, doing a grant application and, to make a story, and then it's actually like not that compelling to people. But, I screened it with 3 different classes, and at least for now, it speaks to most of my students. And maybe it won't speak to your students because it lands differently. Like maybe there's something about the Bay Area, or I don't know, but as of right now, I'm not going to say that it's like, a classic or it'll last forever, but for a moment right now, I think it does represent something, and young people do seem to connect with it and actually find it funny, as opposed to like forced or like, too didactic.
Thank you. Victor Wang asks, as a quantitative modeler with a BA degree in applied disaster and emergency studies and PhD in civil engineering, I'm wondering if there are any suggested effective solutions to the climate injustice conditions that Dr. Z has just articulated.
Well, I mean, I think that there's a lot, what I think, your question is important. And I know that there's the Disaster Hazard Center at University of Colorado. And, there's a lot of important work in the social sciences and the quantitative social sciences and in modeling. And, in my own work, I have always worked with very interdisciplinary groups. Do you know what I mean? And I think it's very important, as somebody who lands more on the humanistic social science side, to continue to work really in an interdisciplinary way, with engineers, with social scientists, with policy makers, and so on. And so I think the best, for me, and this is just my own opinion, I think it's best when there are groups that are really interdisciplinary trying to work on this stuff together. And so I think that, of course, like there are very technical questions about what decarbonization looks like and how to measure that, and, how to implement it from, a policy standpoint. And, but what I'm trying to say is that all that stuff is, all of that, those approaches are really crucially important, as are these other justice-oriented, racial justice, climate justice-oriented ones. And they need to also be seated in those conversations, because you could do all of the empirical work and all of the cool engineering and all the science, and it's still not working right now. So I think that, there's an urgency that justice movements bring in terms of their critique that has to be part of those conversations. And, I think that what that looks like will look different in different states and, different contexts. But to me, I'm a big believer in like very radical interdisciplinarity. And like, not just like my colleague says, she's in the plant sciences, she says interdisciplinary in an ecology standpoint means like a leaf person working with a stem person. I'm really into like radical interdisciplinarity. So like people who make stuff, like make art, talking to a poet, talking to an engineer, and that's what your group is doing, and that's why it's so exciting. So this is a long answer to say, of course there are technical, things that can and should have been done, and should be pushed. But I also think that, what justice advocates do is ask questions in a way that seem outside the bounds of what's possible. But we're in a moment where the questions that seemed impossible to ask are all available to us. And so I think that that's why it's really important to have as big a conversation, as messy a conversation as possible.
Thank you. Do other people in the audience have questions? There's some interest Julian, if you might be willing to share your slides, but I'll let everyone know that this is being recorded and that will be shared with you afterwards.
Oh, sure. I was telling, I had in the last talk I gave where I talked about the historical carbon and the police violence, the one where are just literally, you know, a list of facts. One of the questions was incredibly hostile, you know, started attacking, like, where did you get this from? And, you know, I knew that that was possible. So I had, you know, all of the citations are in the slides themselves, you know, but I think, you know, for me, I'm really struggling and interested and engaged with this question of um, what does decarbonization, demilitarization, decolonization look like? And I think in the book, what I tried to do is document how the social movements are always thinking and crossing boundaries, you know. And so that's why at Standing Rock, you know, you had folks coming from Flint, you know, so they understood their situations as connected, you know. And so I think that it's really I think that's actually a more like more uh, realistic way of like living in the world, you know, to see these things as deeply connected and to feel kinship and empathy. But we live in a moment that is extreme. It's extremely brutal. I mean, it's been brutal, but right now it's like the last gasp. I think, hopefully, it's the last gasp of white supremacy, um, capitalism, and carbon addiction. That's what I basically say in the book, is that those are systems that are trying to maintain um, their monopoly on who gets to live and who is forced to die. And COVID makes it worse.
Yes, thank you. There are a couple more questions now. Pedro Pizzulo asked, since Chinese Americans, oh, sorry, off topic from the talk, but related to Julie's other work, can Julie share how anti-Chinese or xenophobia as it intersects with this argument? Since Chinese Americans have been pivotal to the environmental justice movement, but often left out of accounts.
Yes, that is true. That is a good question. I think that in California, the Asian Pacific Environmental Network have been critical climate justice leaders in terms of both the activism and the policy development. And the work on, I was talking to Bonnie about her work in the Pacific Islands as well. So I think that it's really important to talk about those lineages and how those histories from an Asian American or Asian Pacific Islander standpoint shape these struggles across space and time. And there's so many examples of it. And so, you know, I thought about doing a chapter that talked about anti-nuclear work and the organizing by Filipino justice activists. But I was under a strict like page deadline, you know, so I ended up not doing that. But I think that, you know, there are tons of examples, you know, and so this book is meant to just be like a little primer, and that other people, I mean, there's going to be, unfortunately, lots of other examples of dangers and injustices, you know, and so I think that those stories, those histories are definitely there, and they are those, it's definitely part of the activist landscape globally now. And it's important to not gloss over it. So I appreciate the question. I think the anti-Chinese part of COVID and that question of, you know, this whole thing about like the Chinese virus and what happens with, you know, what happens when landscapes that are when there's when there's development in sort of landscapes in southern China, and this question again of like animal and non-human relations, that's that's the story of this pandemic. It's the story of many pandemics, and it's a story that's only going to be more intense. And so I think thinking about what that looks like in Southeast Asia, what that looks like in Southwest China, I think that there's a lot of work that is being done and should be foregrounded too. But I think that I would love to hear that person's take on that question. It's a great question. But yeah, that's I didn't write on that, sadly.
Thank you. Chanel Wu asks, as someone who has moved from physics and quote unquote pure science and engineering to incorporate more design and humanities art in their work, I've come to one interpretation of digital technology, the way that it's being implemented with big tech, industrialized production, et cetera, that computing today is the tool of the oppressing class. If true transformation can't be accomplished with the tools of the master, I'm misquoting badly, what could abolitionist technological tools look like?
That is a huge question. I don't think anybody knows the answer to this. I mean, I think the most exciting thing is to hear how people ask these questions in their own areas and domains. And so I cannot answer that question, but the fact that you can frame that question and maybe spend like, your life trying to think about it is what's important. I've been working with environmental justice movements since I was a student activist. And I'm like, I do a lot of other things, but I'm a pretty I mean, it's good because environmental justice is really broad. So, even though I say I just do environmental justice, I mean, except for the China work, I've done, I did the second book on China. But mostly I've been doing the same thing for 27 years. And so, I think the good thing about academia is that you can kind of just do your thing, and just keep on doing it in different forms with new questions and new contexts that make that question more salient, have a different valence, and so on. So I can't answer that question, but I would love if you spent your life thinking about it and you did something really cool. But maybe, the point of this talk is just that, you now think, oh, well, what does abolition mean for what I do? And then we'll see. Then it's just, we'll see. It's the thinking about it and the working with others that matters, and working with movements. I mean, that's fundamentally what I believe.
Thank you. Quinn Livingston asks, in one of my classes, we are currently discussing some of the concepts of the systemic structures that science helps to fuel that harm marginalized racial groups. In what ways do you see this happening and changing in environmental movements? Sorry if this is a rudimentary question. I'm young and new to a lot of this.
There are no bad questions, except if it's in the syllabus. Then I say it's in the syllabus. But since this isn't a class and it's not in the syllabus, there's no such thing as a bad question. Is this a version of the earlier question about the master's tools? Like, what can you do if the master's tools, if science and technology are used? Brianne, do you think that that's sort of?
I think it's similar, but maybe particularly how environmental movements are, rethinking these questions of systemic structures in science. Yeah, I don't know. It's similar. Yeah.
Well, I mean, it's hard to generalize. So what I know better is what's happening in California. So my colleague Michael Mendez just wrote a book called Climate Change from the Streets, where he talks about how community members are using scientific and technical approaches to climate change, but sort of bringing their like street science into policy making in the state. And it's grounded in a case study in Oakland, but then also has had impact outside of Oakland to, state level policymaking. So I think there are a lot of really interesting examples in California, not just in climate, but on other issues where environmental justice movements are like use the same kind of like insider out strategy. So they use like these technical tools, scientific approaches, they understand the regulatory game, and then they try to sort of, change within it. And that is definitely happening in California. So not just in climate change, but in specific areas like air quality, pesticides, water. There's been a lot of really important work on water justice in California. And so I think, it's hard to generalize, but a lot of environmental justice groups in California have been doing this, using the science and using and engaging from that standpoint. And what they do that I think is really interesting is to take that kind of justice sensibility into those realms, and they remake the agencies themselves, or they're trying. It's also I think sometimes not more complicated. I mean, it is often more complicated than that. And I think Jill Harrison is your colleague in sociology, and she talks about actually all the problems where that hasn't happened and where there have been struggles. And I don't want to like over romanticize what's happening in California as well. So I think that it's deeply contested, and it's but I think that there have been examples like in California, there's this CalEnviroScreen tool, which was developed by environmental justice activists. That's a highly technical tool that regulators use and so on. So I think, I think with all of these things, there are some really good examples and lots of places where it's hit all kinds of barriers. So I think you just have to kind of look around. It's hard to generalize.
Great, we have some more questions from Chilton Tippin. Do you think the mainstream environmentalist movement, national parks and wilderness and all that, can reconcile itself by incorporating critiques from environmental justice movements? Or is mainstream environmentalism of the John Muir and Aldo Leopold variety a movement of the past that needs to be replaced entirely by environmental justice?
That's a really good question, and it's a complicated one. So a lot of environmental justice movements like in the 80s and 90s really came out of this like really deep struggles. And a lot of the environmental justice movements were really struggling with mainstream environmental movements. The racism in wilderness and conservation, both like, in the moment, but then also historically. And so now, as part of the whole, reckoning and, with that, there's just been this incredible, I mean, outside of environmental historians who knew this already, like there's been this incredible attention to, the roots of eugenics and, and anti-immigrationism and the early founders of wilderness and conservation. There's been a public conversation that was a pretty marginal, like minor one that like the broader public didn't really see. And so in the book, I talk about how in the 1980s, Sierra Club had an anti-immigration slate that almost won, and then in 2016 they passed this Black Lives Matter statement and so on. So I think a lot of the debate between mainstream environmentalism and environmental justice, it's actually like not the same. It's a different conversation now than it was in the 80s. And it's fraught, right? Because a lot of the environmental justice movements, both wanted environmental movements to, think about like what a national strategy meant, the focus on, land trusts and buying land to protect it, the focus on litigation, and the idea that it wasn't, community-based and so on. But on the other hand, it's dangerous from a funding perspective because environmental justice movements generally don't get as much funding anyway if mainstream environmental groups like the Sierra Club start doing more environmental justice movement work. So I think it's like it's this double-edged sword. It's funny though, because I'm actually on the, there's a committee right now to whether the John Muir Institute in the Environment at UC Davis, where, you know, I was the environmental justice project director affiliated with it. And the entire time I was, you know, director, it was like, ooh, because, you know, I had read the anti-Indian stuff that John Muir had written, and I knew the whole legacy of, you know, that history. But, you know, it was just something kind of like, you know, that I was uncomfortable with, but, you know, I didn't really talk about. You know, while Sierra Club, you know, Michael Brune, you know, did this thing about John Muir, you know, and whether, you know, he should be sort of not the hagiographic like father of the environmental movement. And so now we have this renaming committee, like whether the institute should be renamed. And we're doing all of this reading about it. And I'm doing a ton of learning myself. And I don't know what we'll decide, you know, like if we're going to keep the name, if we're not going to keep the name. You know, I think at the end of the day, the discussion about names is important because you learn things if you didn't already know them. And even if you knew some of it, you don't know as much as, you know, like I thought I knew that story, but I actually, there's a whole lot of stuff I did not know. So as a learning exercise, it's important. At the end of the day, you know, this is, if you're going to take a reparations approach, you know, to these questions, like a name change doesn't really fundamentally change the structures or the materiality or the histories. And so I'm not sure that, you know, renaming matters. You know, it might just be another like way to sort of divert attention from real like material change, you know, in the form of reparations, for example. So, I mean, I think you ask a question that is really complicated, and I'm like sitting like in it right now. And I honestly don't know how it'll play out. And I'm not attached either way, you know, but I think that, I think in general, I think it's good that people know that history. Do you know what I mean? I think that you could rename, you know, the Woodrow Wilson School, you could rename this, I mean, but I don't know that the renaming gets at that. I mean, I was just in the Redwoods this weekend up in Humboldt and, you know, reading about the Save the Redwood League. And, you know, all of those folks were like, not just like minor eugenicists, they were like the major eugenicists, you know, in the country. And then they also saved the redwoods. Do you know what I mean? I think it's incredibly complicated. But I do think on the very first step is like education. The political question is what you do with that education. And symbolic renaming is not structural. You know, that's like the easiest thing.
Thank you. Avery Glassman asks, how has your work as an academic informed your work as an activist organizer and vice versa? Have you encountered any incompatibilities? And if so, how did you negotiate them?
Well, I was a student organizer in the 90s. And California, you know, I was telling the class earlier before, in the early 90s was a very like anti-immigrant, 3 strikes you're out, anti-affirmative action. It was a very, very racist, overtly racist landscape in a way that it's not now in California, which doesn't mean that it's not still structurally racist. But, you know, I sort of came of age in that in that organizing, you know, in the Bay Area against 187 and 209 and all of these very racist propositions. And so in that context, I was, you know, I had learned about the environmental justice movement. I worked with environmental justice movements in Boston and then in New York. And then I went back to grad school because there was certain kinds of questions that I couldn't ask in an organizing context that were interesting to me. And I think it was like my ethnic studies background, you know. I, for example, in New York was an organizer. One of the campaigns we worked on was to convert dirty diesel buses. 7 of the 8 diesel bus depots were in Upper Manhattan, in Harlem and Northern Manhattan, which pre-gentrification was majority Black and Latino. It's actually, you know, the demographics have changed, you know, in part because of gentrification. And, you know, there's this whole debate about green gentrification and whether green development actually makes neighborhoods more like available or desirable to people and so on. But, you know, the long story short is when I was an organizer, like I wanted to know why 7 out of the 8 diesel bus depots were there. You know, and that's not a question you can ask in an organizing standpoint, but I wanted to know about the racist histories of zoning, and I wanted to read the cases, and, you know, and so I went back to grad school because I went to a program that was really focused on scholar activism. So, you know, my cohort were people who were organizers around Native sovereignty movements, labor movements, sexuality, AIDS activism. And so there was the culture in our program that we were kind of scholar activists. And there wasn't really a sense that we were going to necessarily be academics. You know, it was just that we had questions we were interested in and we were politically engaged. And so I was really lucky to kind of be in that program. And I didn't know American Studies had a scholar activism like history. I just sort of ended up there. But the entire time I was in grad school, I always worked with movements. My work was always connected to movements. To me, there was no way you can talk about environmental justice and have it be separate from movements on the ground. It didn't work like that for me. So that question of whether there's a conflict, no, I don't think so. And I think it's always grounded me. I mean, there are conflicts in the sense that sometimes like the people themselves, like within the movements, don't like each other. And, you know, I had to think about like, well, what is, you know, what's important to know about that? Is it relevant? Is it airing dirty laundry? You know, but other than those kinds of questions, mostly my continuing relationship with organizers like grounds my work. It gives it a sense of purpose, and it creates the accountability mechanism for me about what I do and why I do it. And so for me, you know, there's no other way to do the work. And then also within a public humanities or environmental humanities like standpoint, like I've never understood work that isn't somehow connected. And that's, you know, again, that idea of connection and how environmental justice as a movement like connects all of these things. Like it makes perfect sense. It makes sense to me and how I think and how I like live in the world. And actually when things are not connected, like I'm deeply offended. I don't like it when things aren't connected. They don't make sense to me. And it's not that I have I'm not judgmental about methodology. You know, I understand the importance of quantitative sociology, for instance, in environmental justice and in sociology. I don't want to do it. That's not my jam. Do you know what I mean? And so this goes back to that question about working in groups. You know, I'm a big believer in big tent with a purpose. Otherwise, I don't see the point. Like I don't see the point of doing research that like is not engaged. I actually don't understand that. But you know, I can that's not what motivates me at all. So.
Well, thank you so much, Julie. I think that's a good point to end now. Unfortunately, we're at our time limit, even though there are more questions, but this has been such a fascinating talk with such thoughtful responses from you, and we really, really appreciate your time and energy with this. So let's all give Julie a virtual round of applause. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
And this will be recorded and sent to you all afterwards.